My name's Simon Borgia. I'm from Safer Wales. We've got really good history with Pride Cymru because back in the day, which was I think almost 20 years ago, we were part of setting up the first Cardiff and Wales Mardi Gras. So we've got a long history as an organisation with Pride. We've also got a lot of experience working with LGBT victims of domestic abuse, particularly male victims through the Dyn Project as well. But LGBT services, equality access services, has been part of our DNA for a number of years. So that's me. So shall I go over to Lisa?
Hi, so my name is Lisa. I am the Comms and Engagement Officer for the LGBT+ National Domestic Abuse Project at Galop. So Galop is a LGBT+ anti-violence charity, and we work all across the United Kingdom to connect LGBT+ specialist domestic abuse services, but also in several other areas, including hate crime, sexual violence, young people's experience, and domestic abuse. So I'm here because we are doing our best to reach people and let them know what help is available, how we can connect them to services to meet their needs. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Thanks for coming. And James?
Hi, thanks, Simon. My name is James Roland. So I'm currently a doctoral researcher at Sussex University. I worked in the domestic violence sector for about 16 years and actually started that in Wales when I was a social worker and worked at the Dyn Project. So working with male victims of domestic violence, in particular gay and bisexual men. And that's something I've kind of kept involved in over the years.
Excellent. Excellent. Before we start, I just want to, obviously this is going out online on YouTube and Facebook, so on and so forth, but just to do a little health check for anyone who's watching this will raise issues for individuals, but there will be information shared around helplines, support agencies, and just to start from that, there is help there, okay? So we will keep revisiting that through the session, okay? So we'll keep plugging Galop, the Dyn Project, and other support services, so they will be widely shared, okay? So we have a series of questions. So I'm going to start from the top. What are the common signs of abuse in LGBTQ relationships, and how can someone tell if they are a victim? Are you okay to start with that, Lisa?
Sure. So I would say one of the most common, very general signs is feeling afraid of someone that they care about, or a family member, intimate partner, ex-partner in their life. And when I say afraid, I don't mean like bone-chilling terror. It might just be that small voice of fear about what's going to happen if you don't let them have power or control in any given moment. And abuse experiences are so broad and diverse that we often offer a lot of questions for people to reflect on, like, does your partner or family member use your gender or sexuality for a basis for threats or harm? Do they call you names and belittle you? Do they control your access to money or force you into unwanted sexual contact? They control your contact with your LGBT+ community, your friends, your family. Are you isolated? And do they threaten to harm themselves if you're going to seek help? And, you know, if any of these are even a maybe, then you might be experiencing domestic abuse. And, you know, you don't have to face that alone. Even if you're not sure of what you're experiencing, you can still access help and learn more about what's happening in your life.
Thank you. And James, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good intro from Lisa, really. And I guess maybe I would answer it in a slightly different way, which is, first of all, to acknowledge what Lisa said, which is domestic abuse can be really different for different people, right? There's no single picture of what abuse might be, and as a result, people really struggle to identify if they're experiencing abuse, because we've all got this picture of what we think relationships are like, and we don't want to be experiencing something that's abusive, often from someone who we also still love, or at least did love, and it can really be hard to transition into that space of recognition. So maybe I'd frame it slightly differently, which is, what's it like looking back on a relationship which is abusive. So it can be really hard going into a relationship and saying, is this abusive? So maybe looking back, and actually I'd say things similar to what Lisa said. If that relationship is marked by fear and worry about the partner, that's really important. And that could be a real indicator. But the other things that people often talk about after a relationship is that their partner was the kind of center of that world. Everything was about them, and the relationship was for them. And then on the other side, that victim, that person experiencing abuse, is often the one who's responsible for everything. So it's their fault something didn't work out, or they needed to do better. So that kind of mix and match between the relationship being for the partner, the abusive partner, and then the victim or the survivor being responsible for everything, I think is a really good way of thinking about it. But also that thing that lots of people say when they leave an abusive relationship over time, which is they rediscover themselves, that there wasn't actually much space for them as a person in their relationship with friends and family. And that space over time had got really compressed. So I think those are some of the things I'd think about as well, about so fear, about who benefits from the relationship and who's got space in the relationship.
It's one thing I picked up from both of you. You've not necessarily talked about violence. You talked about control, fear, and the use of power, because that's a lot of the public story around domestic abuse, isn't it? That it's always about violence. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, Lisa, I don't want to talk over you.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's really hard online, isn't it? You can't quite get the visual, verbal cues. Yeah, no, I mean, the public story of domestic abuse is often really one involving violence, right? And particularly in terms of people being arrested and charged with things, for example. And that's really true. And violence absolutely does form part of many abusive relationships, or at least the fear of violence. But it's not the totality of it. And you can be in an abusive relationship where there is no violence. So, I think it's important to recognize violence as one example of abuse, and one which we perhaps over focus on sometimes, at least in terms of public representation. But it's not the totality of what abuse is. And that can be particularly hard for LGBT people, because there's this story that, you've got a bigger man being violent to a smaller woman is what we often see in the media. And that doesn't necessarily map onto what perhaps a relationship between two men or two women looks like. And so it can be really hard to recognize that as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add on to that. Absolutely agree with everything you've just said, James, definitely. And I think for so many people, they would never expect themselves to be experiencing abuse. And even more so for LGBT plus folks who don't sort of fall into a very limited public idea of what abuse looks like. So when people come to their community or professionals, it's very rare that anyone would walk in and say, I'm experiencing abuse. I'm experiencing coercive control. This is what my experience is labeled as. But they'll start to sort of name behaviors that fall in line with that power and control that we've mentioned. They'll name ideas of themselves as having no choice, but somehow also being at fault for everything. They will mention that fear. They will start to explore that things might not feel okay, but be so scared of what will happen if they leave. There's that huge amount of unknown, because they've sort of been very much coerced to believe that what they're going through is the life that they're going to be dealt, which obviously isn't true. But it becomes very, very difficult to move forward from that. When you have so many voices telling you that your experience is smaller than it is, or that this doesn't fall into a definition of abuse. And I think that just really shrinks people down a lot of the time.
So I think one of my takeaways from what you guys have said as well, that's why I can't stand that. I keep saying that takeaways, because I picked it up on the news. But but I suppose it's difficult for victims to know that they're experiencing abuse, but even if they're not sure, what we're saying is please call out for help, because it doesn't matter to us as support agencies, does it? We'd rather you call, yeah? We'd rather you call than act. Thank you both. Okay, I have another question here. How does abuse in LGBTQ relationships differ to that in heterosexual relationships? Who wants to start with that? You okay to kick off, James?
Okay.
You went first last time, didn't you? No.
I'm glad you're keeping us in good stead, Simon.
It's an order to this.
Order amongst chaos. Well, I think it's really hard, isn't it? Because I think it goes back to what Lisa said right at the start. Like, no one abusive relationship is the same as the other. So every abusive relationship will be dependent on that victim or survivor's story and who they are and where they've come from. It will also reflect the perpetrator's story and who they are or where they come from and where they're both living and what they're both doing at the time. It can be really variable. And some of those things which are the same, we've kind of talked about in terms of things like coercion or threats or intimidation or using emotional abuse or using economic abuse. The big difference for me, I guess, is that I think LGBT people can experience some really unique forms of abuse, and basically I think they reflect where an abuser perhaps is using gender or norms around gender to abuse, and they can kind of almost leverage their partner's LGBT status and their LGBT status, potentially, whatever that might be. So it's things like saying someone's not really LGBT. So say you're in a same-sex relationship and your previous relationships were opposite sex. Your partner may say, well, you're not really lesbian or you're not really gay or whatever that might be. Or they might actually make someone feel quite ashamed of their sexual orientation or gender identity. They may use that and their knowledge that perhaps sometimes people are still struggling with aspects of their identity to abuse further. And sometimes, that might be things like making their partner stay in the closet, as it were, and saying, I don't want to be seen with you because I'm not out, or whatever that might be. So it can really vary, but I guess that's the big difference for me, is how an abuser can use someone's status as an LGBT person to abuse, basically. And there's lots of kind of variations, which, Lisa may talk a bit more about those as well. But the one thing I would say is if people type in something like LGBT power and control wheel onto the internet, what you'll get up is a visual way of looking at what an abusive relationship can be like. And there's lots of different types of abuse. And if you include LGBT, when you search for power and control wheel, what you'll see is a kind of tailored version of that, which gives examples of how those common forms of abuse might look for an LGBT person, and that can be really helpful.
And actually that power and control wheel, I've seen that. That's something we need to share as well, isn't it? Because it comes back to question one, people recognizing abuse, it really does help, doesn't it? Okay, Lisa, have you got anything?
Yeah, absolutely. On the power and control wheel, I would say that is an amazing starting place for anybody who's starting just to question their circumstances and say, okay, this might not feel okay. What can I understand might be happening here if I really took the time to reflect? So on this, I would share my favorite definition of intimate partner abuse, which is any incident or pattern of incidents, behaviors, attitudes where one person attempts to exert control and power over the other person's thoughts, beliefs, actions, particularly with someone they are dating or have had an intimate relationship with. And I like that definition because nowhere in it does it say that you need to be cisgender or heterosexual. So all these pieces are included. All of this is within an LGBT plus experience. But I think where it differs, as James touched on, is where it comes to identity and community, and how that is oftentimes exploited to further control and gain that power. Some examples of that would be threatening to disclose HIV status or intimidating someone to expose their trans history to somebody who's not aware without their consent, and to out them maybe at work for their sexual orientation, knowing that there's going to be ramifications for that, or there's going to be a shift and change that is really terrifying for that other person. Sometimes that can really be undermining their identity expression as well, telling people that, no one's ever going to to see you as a woman. No one's ever going to respect you as a man if those are the genders that people want to perform as. And that can be really diminishing for someone. But on the flip side, that can also be twisted into, no one will see you that way, but I do. And then you should be grateful for your experience. And I think really commonly people are manipulated to believe that there is no help available. They won't be happy. Their experience abuse is normal because of who they are in society. And I think that's one of the biggest difference, is that there's, the context of being vulnerable as an LGBT plus person, which then gets exploited and gains further control. And those pieces of coercive control that really rely on who you are as an LGBT plus person are some of the ones that get, the least recognized, even though they are so distinct and so clear when we meet people, when we see them, how damaging those can be. But yeah.
Okay. Can I just pick up on something Lisa said, because I think it's so important, and I think what you touched on, Lisa, was that an abuser may be someone who knows you best, right? And often the image of a perpetrator is this, it's kind of very 2D. They're the bad person. And actually it's, that people's experience of that is not so simple. So there's for a lot of people in abusive relationships, there's a real push-pull. So this person is the person who is threatening, scary, abusive, all these things that they don't want in their life. But the person is also the person who knows them best, and actually can be sometimes very supportive, sometimes very loving. Sometimes that's quite deliberate. It's after an abusive incident and they're trying to make it right and kind of get the victim or survivor to kind of move on and say, oh, well, I've apologized, let's not talk about that again. But that kind of push-pull is really important, because I think it's a good example of why it can be hard for people to end an abusive relationship or to leave an abusive relationship. And we're very quick to judge people as society for staying in a relationship that's abusive, as if it's their problem. And of course it's not, it's the abuser's problem. But it's really hard sometimes to separate those things out, because that person is also someone you love, who knows you, who knows your experiences, who knows what you need in the world. So it can be really, it's a really tricky balance.
Absolutely. And how, sorry.
No, go on, Lisa.
And how special and lovely it feels at times for people to be seen and recognized. And it's, for a lot of folks, inside their relationship is the most time that they've seen within an LGBT plus relationship, what they've seen of a LGBT plus relationship. So naming what's healthy and okay and normal becomes really hard, because, on more ways than one, healthy examples of relationships and communication and partner dynamics aren't something that we have a lot of access to all the time. So you really start to name your experience based on what you are going through in that moment or looking back. I just wanted to add that in.
Excellent. There's one thing I picked up there, something on what James said and something you picked up on as well, Lise, is something we hear a lot in domestic violence sector is in heterosexual relationships, of course, is why doesn't she leave? But turning that dynamic on why does he abuse, putting that question on the perpetrator, which is very important to keep putting out there, isn't it? That we're not always putting it on the victim. Yeah. Okay, thank you both. Okay, next question. What are the main barriers that make accessing help in these situations difficult? I think it's your turn now, Lisa, to go first.
You remembered that. Okay, sure.
I've got a system in
a little chalkboard in front of you?
Not down.
Okay, so barriers. So I would say generally we operate with the understanding that if experiences of abuse go unrecognized, that oftentimes can delay or sometimes end the help-seeking journey. That's oftentimes the end of the story. And lack of recognition really comes from a limited idea that is very much in the public, as mentioned by James earlier, of a large man and a small woman that are cisgender and heterosexual. And that's not always what it's going to look like. So that piece of recognition really, really can close things off very quickly. And then the more distinct barriers are upheld by myths and stereotypes about partner abuse among LGBT plus folks. So, people stating it's easier to leave because LGBT plus people don't have children. Where did all the children go? I don't know. Where LGBT plus intimate partner abuse is always mutual or not as serious. And, those aren't just offensive. They make it harder for LGBT plus survivors to come forward and engage with community and engage with professionals. And they uphold all the really distinct barriers that affect us so greatly. So I guess on one side, there's personal barriers for yourself where, you're concerned that professionals might be homophobic or transphobic when you go to access help, or a belief that, I'm not even sure of what I'm going through right now, but if they tell me it's not that, then I don't know what's going to happen next. And that's really scary to think that you disclosing the level of vulnerability you feel right now isn't going to be taken seriously. And then from there, you have all the structural barriers where, a lot of services, organizations haven't made it a clear, safe space for LGBT folks to disclose things. So going in, they have to take this huge trust fall to disclose an already extremely personal experience, and then also hope that they're going to be understood, seen, not experience homophobia in that moment. Sometimes there's professional assumptions that everyone is cisgender and heterosexual because the questions don't get asked about sexual orientation, sexual identity, and gender orientation. And then you have sometimes professionals aren't connected with other LGBT plus organizations, so they don't have a place to ask questions when they need to. So then the service isn't as affirming as it could be. That's sort of a rundown of some of the larger ones, but I'd love to hear some more from you, James.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Nice setup and pass on over. I think you've kind of really nailed it, haven't you? And the key phrase that often sticks with me, and it's from some work by an academic called Catherine Donovan and some of her colleagues, is this idea of a gap of trust. So, for some of the reasons that Lisa's talked about, the fact that perhaps services don't demonstrate that they're obviously LGBT friendly in a safe space, and because people perhaps don't see this public story of LGBT people experience domestic abuse too, there's a gap between how we perceive perhaps ourselves as a victim or survivor and what we think those services can do for us. And that can be quite hard to leap over. And, I think it's something LGBT people will recognize as a kind of daily experience, right? Of either having to come out or having to decide if somewhere is a safe space. And sometimes I think if you're not LGBT or not particularly LGBT aware, people have this idea sometimes that you kind of come out once and then that's fine, you're kind of done, and you can access services without worry. And that, maybe if you're in a boy band and you're on the front of the page of the Sun at some point, that's true. But for most people, every time you go to a new job, the first time you go to your GP, you go to A&E, wherever you go, you're making a decision about whether you say you are LGBT directly or doing that indirectly by talking about your partner and perhaps naming their pronoun. And, I can remember once phoning a service, generic service, and they happened to need to know about my partner's details at the time. And they just asked, asked about my partner's details and referred to her as a her. They didn't think, barely a moment thought. But for me, that really resonated with me. I suddenly went, oh, so we're making some assumptions here. And then I had to decide in that split moment whether it was okay for me to go, actually, my partner's, and then go on from there. And that's a really benign example, right? That's just me accessing a fairly standard service. So if that's someone in a moment of crisis, the service they don't know, who has to then make a decision to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity, that can be a real hurdle, which is why it's so important that services do go out of their way to say this is a safe space, and that's about having the right imagery, using the right language, making sure staff are trained. So, you know, that gap of trust is really important to recognise, and then realise how hard that can be to leap over, because somebody's having to disclose an experience of abuse and potentially disclose that they're LGBT, and neither of those things are necessarily safe to do if you're not sure. Which is why accessing services like Galop or like Dyn can be really important, because you at least know they're a safe space, right, as an LGBT person. And they might be able to help you kind of get into the other services too. You know, they can be your route in to that kind of support for more generic services where perhaps you're a bit unsure about what would happen.
Yeah, so, and can I just add one thing to that? So on top of, you know, ensuring that the space is obviously inclusive, be blunt, be obvious. there's no mystery needed around letting LGBT plus people know that they're safe in a space. But on top of that, if you label your space as safe, open, welcoming, I think it's also important to eventually do the work to make sure that when you do take on a disclosure, that you have enough knowledge and tools to respond to that with empathy and affirmation and inclusion, and know sort of where to direct people. So any professionals watching, you are also welcome to call Galop and other organizations and ask a question. People will always, I'm going to be bold and say that yes, people will always be happy to answer the question if it's going to help you better support an LGBT plus person.
That's a real important message, because I was just thinking then about what both of you were saying, where the constant thing we hear is the police, I don't want to report to the police, the perception of homophobia, they won't believe me, so on and so forth. But exactly, services and projects, safe space, we can help people navigate through those systems, can't we? We're able to advocate, open doors, so on and so forth. So somebody doesn't have to do that. Yeah. Okay, thank you both. We're flying through these, thank you.
Not my turn to start this time. I'm keeping track too now.
Is that because you know the next question's a hard one? You need to kind of pitch it at the right level.
Yeah, that's like a real bad one here. How is the current COVID-19 pandemic having an impact on LGBTQ plus people in abusive relationships?
This is when I claim my signal's going and drop out suddenly, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Over to you, Lisa. I think, I mean, God, you know, COVID's just been so massive, hasn't it? I mean, you could run a whole webinar day, week on this. And I guess, you know, maybe it's worth just saying, you know, for everyone, COVID's had all these effects, from just the general level of anxiety or worry that people might experience, and you know, this constantly changing situation, having to adapt to it. Pretty, you know, I found that pretty exhausting. Then suddenly your ability to access people, whether that's your friends, whether that's professionals, has really changed, because you know, from tomorrow in England, we won't be able to. We're going back into lockdown. Obviously, in Wales, you know, Wales has just had its still in the firebreak, right, and due to just about to come out. So like you literally can't then get access to services. So it's had a huge impact, I think. And for LGBT people, I guess it's a bit like what we've talked about domestic abuse already. There's the kind of experience that anyone might have of COVID, and then sometimes that can be made just more difficult and more challenging if you're LGBT, as for any particular kind of community, perhaps. So, you know, there was some really interesting stuff around on the BBC, for example, about people who were found that they were in lockdown with their family, where they did not feel safe. Perhaps their family weren't very accepting of their sexual orientation or gender identity. People were cut off from their support networks suddenly. And I think that's the kind of impact it's had. And then on the other side, of course, it just puts real pressure on services, right? And services are suddenly either have staff not around because they're off, or are trying to work remotely, and demand's really gone up for a lot of domestic abuse services, because people are literally trapped potentially with the person who's being abusive, or perhaps they are realizing what's going on during that time and kind of making a decision that that's not something they want to to kind of live with. So I think, COVID's been a bit of a pressure cooker in a sense. It's kind of brought a lot of those things to the fore. The only other thing I'd mention around that, I think it's really also illustrated how ill prepared we often are to respond to people who are LGBT, kind of as in terms of like strategy. So like, if the interesting thing about COVID is suddenly everyone had to turn around and do stuff, right? Like, we're worried that people may be stuck at home with an abuser. How do we communicate that that's not okay and help and support is available? But because a lot of areas weren't necessarily doing lots of work around LGBT stuff already, LGBT stuff quite quickly dropped off the radar or wasn't always up in front and center as well. So I think it's really emphasized the importance of organizations like Galop, so that there is a kind of point of contact that people definitely know is there and is available for them, and can provide help and support if they need it.
Okay, Lisa, have you got anything to add?
I mean, yes to all of that. That was a great answer, James. This is what I get for teasing you about going first. So a few things that I would just keep in mind are I think the level of choice and the choices LGBT plus people are having to make right now for themselves, and also the lack of choice that's happening right now in an effort to keep everyone safe from the pandemic. So around people returning home, I think a lot of survivors are facing really, really difficult decisions about safeguarding for themselves and what they can cope with at this time. So having this very, very, very coerced choice, not a free choice, this is very much a coerced choice over whether they are going to closet parts of themselves, parts of their identity, to make lockdown in a home where they might not be welcome to be LGBT plus safe for themselves, or whether they, and I guess within that also all the mental wellness repercussions of doing that, because there will be repercussions of having to closet parts of yourself, or potentially being out, continuing to be themselves, but then managing potential judgment or additional abuse in addition to what they're already experiencing. I think that's an impossible decision that a lot of people are having to make right now. And then around the intersection, so for LGBT plus folks with physical disabilities or who are at higher risk of contracting the virus, they've been shielding, they've been on additional lockdown times, they are at all this additional risk, but that person might have a disability, they might be LGBT plus, and they might also be experiencing abuse. So then COVID can also become a tool of further control and further power for those people, which is a really difficult thing to do, to have organizations that are going to see you as a whole person and recognize your entire experience. And then that isolation, I think some LGBT plus folks have one place a week where they can fully express and be themselves. And I think it's really scary to not have that outlet anymore and not have that release anymore. For our helpline, generally people call in and we're always there to listen and connect them with services, give emotional support, offer advice when it makes sense to do so. But right now, there's been a lot of people calling and a lot of people who are hitting that point of needing to make a change and needing a referral to immediate help, to immediate services, because within lockdown measures, people are hitting that point a bit quicker, not being able to tolerate the context of their experience that much longer. So absolutely, it's having an impact, and it's an impact that I think we're going to be looking back on for a really long time and continually learning more about what is actually happening and what actually has happened.
We're trying to figure it out. We're trying to assess and figure it out as we go along, aren't we? But I suppose for services have mobilised and adapted. Because I noticed with us right at the beginning of COVID, we had a drop off in calls, for example, but doing more intensive support for men, like holding on to cases longer. But we've seen things pick up, and I think that's been quite common across the sector as well. But I think consistently there's been support there, hasn't there? We haven't just fallen off a cliff. for example. We can remote work. One thing, just to add to this, is something we've come up much more about, which does tap into access to services, is digital poverty as well. People who do not have access to web-based internet, some of those things a lot of us take for granted as well. We've noticed that with certain groups.
And Simon, also, I guess, space, right? Like, so there's one of the interesting things about the whole COVID thing has been assumptions about space. So, you know, I can remember early on lots of people in the media saying, oh, all these people in parks being irresponsible. And, you know, it's like, well, if you don't have a garden and you live in a tiny flat, you probably want to be in the park at some of the time. But the same logic applies to working on or getting help online, right? If you're sharing space and you don't have somewhere private, you know, do you want to be speaking to someone from your room where you're also going to be sleeping? So I think the issues of digital poverty are really massive, but they also link to kind of wider structural issues about poverty and access to resources and how challenging that can be. But again, I guess going back to your point, that's why if you do reach out for services, kind of working with them to perhaps try and find some solutions to support people around that as best they can.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I would say, in addition to that, one thing I always encourage everyone to keep in mind is that you know, risk is not distributed equally. So when we assess people, we always need to look at all the factors of their life and try to understand fully what's happening. And, you know, by reaching out to a service like our Helpline, there, if you can, we have Helpline and web chat service if you can't speak verbally out to somebody, to try and navigate what the safest way for you going forward is going to be to communicate with people, because we know that isolation shrinks options, abuse shrinks options, sometimes lockdown shrinks options, but there are people who are willing to explore all of the options to try and find a way to connect.
Thank you both. I've got one eye on the clock as well because of Kath. So, okay, I've got another one for you both. This one's going to start with you, Lisa. So how can people who experience abuse safely access help? I know we touched on quite a bit of this, but should we just go back over this? Because I think this is a very important one. How can they safely access help and support?
Definitely. So we've mentioned it more than once, but Galop does have a national helpline. It's available Monday to Friday, and on Wednesday and Thursday evenings, there's also a web chat service functioning. So when you reach out, you are reaching out to a LGBT plus person who has knowledge of domestic abuse, who is going to be able to advise you on support that might be closer to you, who can refer you in, who's also going to listen to you and not just take action. This is someone who is going to hear what feels okay for you and what you want to happen. Or even if you just have questions, if a behavior is normal, if you're supposed to feel like this, it's okay just to call and hear another voice that you can disclose to in a way that's not judgmental, in a way where you know, you're going to be safe for who you are, and then the rest is going to be led by you. As well, you know, we know that a lot of people are going to reach out to someone in their life before they reach out to a professional service. So one option that everyone has is to start to talk to somebody that they trust in their life. There are resources and tools for people who are worried about a loved one in their life. And even if people don't know how to name what's happening, they can speak to somebody they trust to start forming that line of support and let them know that they might not feel safe, or they're unsure if what's happening for them is normal. And then you also have options like your GP, like the pharmacy, to disclose that you aren't feeling safe. And they hopefully will be able to respond to that in a way that recognizes what's happening. Oftentimes doctors' offices will have a telephone or somewhere that you can reach out to in a way that's quite confidential. In a very practical sense. So in a crisis situation, you know, if you are in crisis and you're experiencing something, no matter who is making the crisis happen in your life, you know, you can always call 999. We often talk people through setting up the emergency SOS settings in their phone so that they don't actually have to call anybody. And if you do call 999 and you can't talk, because, you know, some people have that moment of, okay, things are about to go bad. Things are about to get scarier. If I pick up the phone and call the police, it's going to get worse right now. You can dial 999 and then press 55 to let the operator know that you're not safe at that moment. That's obviously in the crisis scenario when you really feel like you need to do that. But, you know, talking to someone you trust, reviewing resources like the Power and Control Wheel, exploring websites like Galop's website to start to learn more and explore things in a way that feels okay for you. Those can be some of the first steps as well.
Excellent. Thank you. James, have you got anything to add to that?
Only a kind of couple of observations, really, because I think that's a really great answer. I think what Lisa said about friends and family is really important. You know, it's very common for people to reach out to friends and families first. So, and that can be really hard for the friend and family. So they can access a lot of these services too and say, look, this is what I'm worried about. This is what someone said to me. What's good advice? What should I do? Because, you know, that's really hard to know how to respond. Obviously, we've talked about Galop. There are other helplines too. So in Wales, I think it's the Fear Free helpline, isn't it? So an all Wales kind of domestic abuse helpline. There's also something called the Men's Advice Line, which does similar work, obviously specifically for men. So, you know, depending on what works for you, there's several different options. And the other thing I would say as well is to just think about some of those options in terms of thinking through your safety plan, and that's sometimes something you might want to do with a service helping you, but you know, knowing what that helpline is and how you can get in touch with them for advice, because that can be really hard in a moment of crisis to necessarily kind of keep that in mind. And also recognizing the police are there in an emergency, and that obviously is really difficult to make that decision to call. But you know, you are in immediate risk, or someone is in immediate risk, that's also got to be an option.
There's one thing I like to just observe what you both said is that I think it's important for people watching this is how the helplines work with each other as well. Because I know we've done cross work with Galop, we've done cross work with the Men's Advice Line, so we're providing support for men in Wales, but we also get calls from men in Wales to go to the Men's Advice Line but come back to Dean. So everything's quite coordinated, and the same with the Live Fear Free helpline. So I think there are a suite of options for people out there. And I think what you said, James, about a trusted friend or family member, I think that certainly helps, doesn't it, with opening that door, opening that gate, just as a kind of, where do I start? What should I do? How can I help? So on and so forth. Yeah.
And I guess maybe just one other thing, you know, sometimes people make disclosures and they don't get a good response, right? And it's really is this kind of sad truth. And, you know, I guess the one thing I would also say is if that happens to you, don't presume that that's going to be the response you get from everyone. You know, if you make a disclosure to a friend and they tell you to kind of just stick with it, or it's not as bad as it seems, you know, think on that, reflect on that, but remember that they're not the kind of final arbiter, right? Like there's always an option to speak to someone else, because if you're worried about this stuff, at the very least, what you deserve, I think, is the chance for someone to go, yeah, I hear what you're saying, right? I kind of honour your disclosure, and what's that like for you? And what might you do? So, you know, don't, if you do get a bad experience, don't, you know, that can be really hard, but don't necessarily stop there. Like, do know that there is help and support, and you can find your way to it. And it's important for you that you can get help and support.
I suppose for us as services as well is if people do have a bad experience with an agency, we can also raise that in different forums, different levels, and feed some of that stuff back as well to improve practice as well. Okay.
Absolutely. One more thing to add on that very quickly. Absolutely, yes, some of those experiences are going to be very difficult the first time, sort of reaching out to someone or communicating about it. And I'd always say, you know, things aren't maybe going to happen in a straight line. Things might go back and forth, and you know, you'll always be welcome back to services, always welcome back into conversations. Starting a conversation doesn't mean that you are committed to sort of following any specific direction. It just means that you're starting to explore ways to feel more safe in your life.
Thank you both. Thank you. Okay then, what advice would you give to someone who suspects that someone they know has experienced abuse? I know we've touched on this, but this is like a friend, family member. What advice would we give to them? I think it's James's turn.
We were just hesitant, waiting.
Not that bad.
So you're such a strict chair, Simon, and Lisa and I wouldn't dare to step out of alignment. Well, I think we kind of touched on this, and I guess it can be really hard to disclose domestic abuse, or say you're scared about something or worried about something. It can also be really hard if you see that happening to a friend or family member, because how on earth do you start that conversation, right? But I would say, if you can, to do so, and to choose the right time for that, and to do that in an open as way as possible, right? So if you barrel in going, are you experiencing domestic abuse? I probably think you are. I really don't like that person. Probably not going to work. So I think some of that stuff about, are you okay? How are things going? Those really open questions, which give people space if they want to answer that question, and talk without, a bit like Lisa said, without committing to anything, right? Kind of keeping it general, because it's really hard to step into that space. I'd also say keep asking, albeit, be mindful of the kind of pushback you might get. So, and making sure someone knows you are there for them, whatever may be going on, you're there for them, because that's really important. And if you're not sure, just speak to one of these services, get some advice, because there's some really good resources. I think Galop's got some on its website for friends and family too, about how you can have conversations with people, the kind of things you might need to know. So that hopefully if someone discloses or just raises the question, you're kind of honouring that disclosure and hearing them, and then kind of giving them some options, I guess. And the key thing to remember is you're not a domestic abuse specialist. You don't have to solve this for someone. What you can hopefully do is help them recognise that something's not okay, help them recognise that if something's not okay, it's fine to try and get some help around that and explore it, and then hopefully help them get to someone who can do that exploration with them in a safe way.
Lisa, over to you.
That was really lovely, James. Yeah, I support everything that was just said. Absolutely. One thing I always keep in mind for family members, friends who are witnessing someone go through a really difficult experience like abuse, or what they think might be abuse, is always, listen but don't push. If that person is experiencing abuse, someone is already taking a lot of control in their life. So you can also go down that path of taking control in their life, because you need to listen and create that safe, healthy space for them, not jumping to directives like, you have to leave your home this minute, we have to do something now. Because that actually replicates enforcing more control in their life. So listening, giving empathy, letting them know options, letting them know that you are there for them, or very gently letting them know, I've noticed things and I want to see if you're okay. And likely, they're not going to respond with, I'm going through abuse, or my partner is coercively controlling me. They're likely going to describe behaviors that might be violent, that might be controlling, that are abusive, but might not say the word. So really listening to what they're describing to you and letting them have that space to describe it without jumping into action is so important. And you can contact all the services we've mentioned. You can pass them on to your friend. And essentially, a lot of what James said, I think more practically, if you're really worried about someone and you think, I don't feel safe myself getting involved with this, but I recognize that something's happening, you can actually really clearly explore safe ways to keep in contact regularly, so that they are speaking with you and that they are speaking with someone, whether that's a weekly call at an agreed upon time, or agreeing on a code. Like, a blue heart for I need help and a sunflower for I'm not safe to talk. Just texting those so that you have a way to communicate with them and that you know they're going through this. They might not be ready to do things, but I know that they're going to communicate to me and come to me if they need me. Again, you're not a professional. So make sure if this is happening and if they are coming to you as one of their main supports, that you are getting support for yourself as well, so that you're not carrying that alone, because it can suddenly feel like a big responsibility, but you have to keep in mind that you can be there for someone, but being responsible over another person's well-being is a huge thing to take on. So making sure that you are well informed, that you do have people helping you if you feel really responsible in someone's life. And if, immediate danger piece comes up again, there are actions you can take. There are resources available to you. As well as a friend, if your friend is edging up to potentially leaving, you can always offer them practical advice from some of the guides that we have for friends and family, and also some of the practical guides we have for survivors. If you're not a survivor yourself, you can still look through those resources and try to learn more what someone might be going through and be a bit better able to empathize with them.
Yeah.
Can I add one other thing, if that's all right, which is just to recognize that it can be really tough for friends and family sometimes, and that's because someone you care about, love is you can see what's going on for them. But it's also really important to remember that sometimes, and quite commonly, in fact, abusers will use friends to abuse, right? So they will deliberately disrupt social events. They will make it difficult for the victim or survivor to go to events or see their friend. They'll make accusations about someone's friend, and that's all intentional. It's designed to reduce the number of people that someone can access and can get support from, but also who can say what's going on, right? So ultimately, an abuser wants one person to be the authoritative voice about what is fact and what is not fact, and they don't want friends going, hang on, no, that doesn't seem right. I saw what happened. It wasn't your fault. Something else was going on. It was what your partner did. So it's important, I think, as a family or friend member to A, recognize it's hard, B, sometimes perpetrators and abusers will deliberately try and undermine the relationship you've got, and sometimes that those two things mean sometimes there's not much you can do, but what you can do is be there. And it might be that you kind of feel almost a bit distanced for some time because you are waiting for someone, but letting them know that you're still present, letting them know that you aren't going to hold them responsible for that and kind of make them the problem. You are just still there for when they need you, I think is a really powerful message. And it's like Lisa said, you can't go in saying you need to do the following things. And what someone needs to know is they've got someone they can rely on, who's safe.
And also some of those people to rely on could be people in the workplace as well, couldn't it? It's like workplace supervision, domestic abuse policies, so on and so forth. So it's not all on friends and families. It's just navigating, isn't it? Finding that person to help. Okay, thank you both. Our final question is going to be, I think this one's going to be quite difficult, okay? So what advice? I shouldn't present the question.
What? Feed forward, like buckle up, get ready.
Yeah, so, okay then.
This one's for you, Lisa.
Oh, sorry, it's gone. No, what advice would you give to those from non-conforming gender community getting help and support?
Okay. So
I think it's your turn now, Lisa, isn't it?
I think so too. Just pausing for a moment to reflect, because there's a lot of pieces to this question. So right off the bat, I would say that our trans non-binary survivors of domestic abuse are one of the most hidden groups, not by their choice, but by societal recognition of abuse. They're very hidden, and they have a lot of lack of recognition. So immediately I would want them to know that they can listen to themselves and what their experiences and what their feelings are, and not necessarily let others decide what their experience is. Some of the things that might not fall into a traditional idea of abuse are, outing someone's gender history to others, using the wrong pronouns on purpose, dead naming you on purpose, trying to convince you to perform as the gender you are not, trying to coerce any part of your transition or fetishizing your body, is all a part of abuse. That is absolutely a valid experience of abuse to be going through that. And anybody who is exploiting any ideas about transphobia and that this pain, suffering, abuse that you're going through is somehow aligned with your experience as a trans person is absolutely wrong. And anyone who tells you that masculine presentation, feminine presentation, age, size, weight is an indication of who is victim and perpetrator in a situation, that's just not how you know. That's not a part of it. It is very much about power and control. That is what it is. That is exactly what I would want someone to know. And speaking very clearly, there are going to be a lot of abuse conversations which will exclude you based on a really limited idea about who a victim survivor is, but your experience is valid. There's help available, which is going to hear you and recognize you as a whole person. You should not have to shrink, alter any part of who you are in order to get help, because, it happens where people feel like they have to sort of adapt in order to get help and shrink themselves a lot of the time. And I think that's so unfair and unnecessary. But there is a whole legacy of negative experiences that inform that. But I just really want to affirm that there are services that are never going to ask you to do that. They do exist. And, we can help you connect with them, and we can be one of those services. All of the people on this chat right now. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. James, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a great answer from Lisa. And I guess what really resonated with me was that idea of kind of shrinking, right? And shrinking and or hiding. And that's what often abusers in relationships expect their partner to do. So we don't and shouldn't be asking people to do that. We should be taking them on face value and kind of working with them from where they are. I guess the thing I would say is kind of perhaps a more practical answer as well, which is that some of the stuff we talked right at the beginning about the barriers people may feel about accessing services could really be relevant, I think, to anyone who's kind of from a non-conforming gender community and thinking about, well, what is it you need to know to feel safe about accessing a service? And it might be that you do want to reach out to something like Dyn or Galop or another LGBT provider in the first instance, because they might be able to help you navigate those services. Or it might be you want to think about, well, what would I expect that service to be saying at the front door, whether that's a literal front door or probably more likely an online one, their website, about how it thinks about these issues and where it's put them. So if you go to a service which has nothing on the experience of LGBTQI people, well, you might make some judgments about that. If you've got a service which is kind of really upfront and center and has a specific set of resources and kind of says what it's doing around all its communities that it serves, well, you might feel a lot more confident about accessing that services and knowing, as Lisa said, that you'll be kind of recognised and supported. So I think there's practical things you can do yourself to make sure that you are comfortable with the service that you are accessing, but and otherwise access those existing LGBT services in the first instance to kind of help with that process.
Okay, do either of you, one of the observations there is that obviously that's experience within a sector as well, isn't it? So I suppose for victims, it's their experience, it's theirs, isn't it? And maybe some people might think that we haven't shared these things before, but we have. Do you see what I mean? That we do have the experience in the sector, don't we? We do create that space, and we are flexible as well, but we do have that experience. I think that's really important to feed out, because I know a lot of people just think that we haven't heard it before, but we have Yeah, you've got that experience.
Mm.
Lisa, did you want to add something? You look like you were going to...
Yeah, I did. I was just reflecting. So on the screen right now, I know that my pronouns are up, but I recognize that not everyone will be able to read those. So I just want to affirm that my pronouns are she, her, for anyone that's listening right now. And I also had a bit of a thought about, it can't always be the responsible of the gender non-conforming person to manage all the processes. It's also on us as professionals to make sure that if we are working with trans and non-binary folks, that we are correcting people when they use the wrong pronoun, that we are making sure that the accurate name is on documents that are following this person. And if there's another name on a document, make sure you're checking with that person. Make sure you are doing your job to affirm and recognize and protect their identity as they need you to, because there's going to be a lot of things that feel very distant, but it's something we can do all the time, actually, is make sure that people are being recognized for who they are, which makes the system, which makes all of our networks a lot stronger and a lot better at making sure that people feel safe and feel like they can trust all of us enough to be here to get help.
Yeah, can I add? I've got a list of things here that I sometimes, when I do training on LGBT domestic abuse, that I say these are the top things that you as a professional could do. And if there are professionals perhaps watching or services watching, maybe this would be helpful. But one, get training, right? Like, it's not okay just to assume you can do this. You need specific LGBT training, ideally on LGBT domestic abuse itself, and that can be part of a bigger package, right? But you need to have actually done the homework. You need to be able to signal acceptance of LGBT people in your service, on your online, in terms of everything you do. So that's appropriate imagery, appropriate language, forms give people the right options, right? You need to be able to tailor your service to meet the needs of LGBT victims. It's not okay to say, oh, well, we don't discriminate, everyone's equal. You need to have tailored services for different needs, in the same way that someone who is from a Black and minority ethnic community and who is LGBT needs that service to recognise both those things may be relevant to them. You need to have access to the right resources. Like we talked about the LGBT power and control wheel. You need to have that stuff to hand. You shouldn't have to go and find it. Like, it needs to be available when you first see that person. And they also need to be familiar with local pathways. So know who your local LGBT services are, know who your national ones are. And then last, I think this is Lisa's point it links to, is like, make sure your policies and procedures are inclusive. You shouldn't be making this stuff up that when you first meet someone who's LGBT and trying to access your service should be ready. In the same way it should for all sorts of issues, to be able to deal with someone when they need it, rather than having them wait. So, those would be my top 6, I guess. And I think it's a useful reflection, maybe.
I'll add one. Let's make it 7.
Great. I love 7s.
Love 7s. So in addition to that, I know that people are scared about making assumptions about people, or that's sometimes brought up, is that people are worried about making assumptions. But if you aren't assuming that someone is of a specific sexual identity or a different gender orientation to yourself, then you are assuming that they are the same as you, that they are the same. So you're making an assumption either way. So if you don't have a process that asks the question, then no matter what, those assumptions are going to keep going. So you have to have the space to ask the questions and have it safe enough for people to answer. I think that's when I see a lot of is, that nervousness about assuming and upsetting someone. But if you're assuming one way or the other, questions are kind of the only way to move past that.
That's an excellent point, because I think you pick up that in training and events. People just get so stuck on that first thing, don't they? Tripping themselves up, and then everything falls apart after that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you ask a question well, it's really respectful, right? Like, you're not the expert. The person you're speaking to is the expert in their own life, and so it's fine to kind of put that on the line and say, well, you tell me, what's important to you, what do you need me to know, and owning that if you don't understand some of that, I think can be really respectful. So it's, you know, but like Lisa says, you're making an assumption one way or another, so better do that kind of transparently and openly, and recognize that you might have got it wrong, and in which case apologize, make sure you understand what you need to be doing, and then move on, right? Like rather than pretending it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to protest to you saying, I want to make sure I'm understanding you as best as possible. People want to be understood. They want you to ask. They just need to know it's safe to answer you.
Excellent point, Lisa. Excellent point. We're up on time now. I think we've done that within an hour.
I'm so sorry. I know you're being an excellent chair and keeping. Can I mention one thing that we haven't?
I'm Chair James. I was just going to say. My closing remarks, that's all. So I was going to give you the space, but I'm not going to do it. So, James, do you want to give the floor to yours?
Thank you so much, Simon. I suppose the one thing I wanted to acknowledge is something we've kind of touched on, but haven't talked about specifically, which is actually people who use violence and abuse, right? So we've focused our conversation on victims and survivors of abuse, but the reality is violence and abuse is it's done by someone, and I guess, you know, we don't have time to get into that now, but it's important, I think, some of those messages we've given about people recognizing their behavior and recognizing their experiences and seeking help. That's really true for victim survivors. It's also kind of true for perpetrators and people using violence and abuse. So, you know, if you are doing things which, having listened to this conversation, or based on what you've seen with your partner or people have fed back to you, which make you feel uncomfortable, which make you question about whether you're using threats or intimidation, or whether your partner feels unsafe, it's important to recognize that's on you, and you need to think about how you can reach out for help too, and potentially change your behavior. So, and recognizing that's possible, right? So violence and abuse is a choice. So we can choose to be violent and abusive, but we can also choose to stop being violent and abusive. So things like the Respect phone line are a really important resource for that, where people can talk through what somebody is perhaps doing in their relationship, if they're uncomfortable with it, or they're worried about it, and give them advice about what they could do next so that they can change their behavior and aren't using violence and abuse, because, you know, violence and abuse are just never okay.
Brilliant. We'll make sure we share that information as well with clients. Thank you, James. Lisa, anything you'd like to close off with?
What do I want to say to everyone listening? I guess I would want everyone to know that I know that some of the things we're talking about right now are going to hit deeply with some people, and may actually create a situation where some people are sitting back and, much like James said, recognizing that they are a part of a situation involving abuse. And if you are a victim survivor who has suddenly realized that a lot of your experience is aligning with the things we've talked about today, that the one thing I want you to take away the most out of all of this is that there is help available. There is LGBT plus specialist help available that wants to hear you and listen to you and help you if they can. And if you have questions, and if you are at the very first day of even considering that there might be abuse in your relationship or abuse that you're receiving from family, that there's people who are willing to meet you at that point. And I'm assuming underneath this video, there's going to be many links to those supports that are going to be able to recognize you for a whole person, for the intersections of your life that you're dealing with. And you don't have to carry it alone. You don't have to. It's really scary to bring someone into it, but you do not have to face what you're going through by yourself. Yeah, I think that's what I would want people to know the most.
Excellent. I think exactly that. You know, we're there to help. The help is there, and obviously, you know, we're there to listen, aren't we? And that's what we do. That's what we do every day. So, I'll make sure that Pride Cymru share the helplines, and anyone watching, there is help available, and we will share helplines, websites, so on and so forth. But also any comments from people watching and listening to this would be welcomed as well. So and thank you, James. Thank you, Lisa. And if there's nothing else, should we close?